right, friends, we're going to pick up with our second presenter for session 3. Most of you have probably been in touch with her as one of the intrepid organizers of this conference, so thank you, Daniela, for that. She is a musicologist who studies Jewish immigrants' engagement with opera in the 20th century, trends in the history of the democratization of opera in America, and the evolution of the Yiddish operetta. She is currently a research fellow at UCLA's Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience, and is also teaching at all the good places in Los Angeles, at UCLA, University of Southern California, and Occidental College. So she's got it covered. She has given invited talks at UCLA, at the Cal Institute for Yiddish Culture and Language, and the Jewish Music Forum. From 2021 to 2023, she was part of the Dybbuk Project, an interdisciplinary collaboration based at Tel Aviv University, exploring turn-of-the-century popular Yiddish theater. Currently working on a book about the significance of opera for Yiddish speakers in early 20th century America. Very excited to hear about this. She has a doctorate in musicology from Stanford, a master's in piano performance from NYU, and a bachelor's in complet and music from Princeton University. Today, she'll be speaking with us about the silent Jewish underscoring of abridged English language opera and the NBC-TV Opera Theatre. Please welcome Daniela.
Thank you, Joy. We enjoy culture that makes us feel intensely. Whether at a musical performance like last night, a sporting event, or a Broadway show, many people love being swept up into drama that they watch with bated breath. Especially in the realm of screen culture, a constant source of attraction for audiences is a show's ability to stimulate an emotional response, even as the content that does so varies across genres and changes over time. Today, I want to consider the roots of one group of people's desire in mid-20th century America to use television to share the emotional power of opera with the general public. Let's start by listening to some music. This rousing overture is from an 1831 opera comique called Zampa, or The Marble Bride. Zampa, as I'm sure you can tell from the music, is a pirate. This music was used to ring up the curtain on a wide range of early 20th century Yiddish operettas in New York, suggesting that its emotional energy was sufficiently generic to be transferable to any number of dramatic contexts. The information about Zampa's ubiquity comes from the memoirs of Samuel Chotzinoff, one of the many Russian Jewish immigrants who came to New York in the early 20th century. Chotzinoff, known as Shotzi, was for many years NBC's music director, gaining special fame for having persuaded a notoriously reluctant Arturo Toscanini to return to the US in 1937 to be the conductor for NBC's Symphony of the Air. Chotzinoff was also an accomplished pianist, accompanying Ephraim Zimbalist and Yasha Heifetz, whose sister Pauline Chotzinoff married. In addition, he was a music critic, journalist, author, novelist, and playwright. He also established the NBC-TV Opera Theatre. Lasting from 1949 to 1964, the NBC Opera was Chotzinoff's pet project, which he was able to pursue despite logistical and financial challenges, with the backing of another Russian Jewish immigrant, head of NBC David Sarnoff, together with Czech conductor Peter Hermann Adler, who was, you guessed it, also a Jewish immigrant. Though there were other TV opera initiatives at mid-century, I focus here on NBC's program because it was by far the most extensive, visible, and long-lasting of its kind. The NBC Opera Theatre, later renamed the NBC Opera Company, was a television program offering abridged English language versions of well-known European operas, as well as a few relatively obscure ones, together with new operas in English commissioned specially for TV, most famously Menotti's Amal and the Night Visitors. I can share this full repertoire list for those who want a closer look later, but this is just to give you a basic overview. The program's goal was to promote a new type of accessible and entertaining opera, reflecting the prevailing mid-century ideology of integration that sought to combine the values and content of high culture with the appeal of popular culture. The NBC Opera can thus be seen as part of the mid-century, quote, cultural explosion or cultural boom, driven by the confluence of technological developments and Cold War politics, as well as being a continuation of the long-standing American tradition of opera for the people. Scholars such as Jennifer Barnes, Brian Rose, and most recently Danielle Ward-Griffin have studied various aspects of NBC's initiative. But there is one component that has remained unexplored. Drawing on memoirs, archival sources, and contemporary scholarship, I suggest that the Jewish background of the NBC Opera's main personnel, Samuel Chotzinoff and David Sarnoff, particularly their upbringing in a Jewish and Yiddish-speaking cultural and political environment, informed their motivations for and approach to adapting prestigious culture to maximally appeal to audiences, in addition to being significant for the subsequent development of opera in America. I argue that the NBC Opera was shaped by its creators' experiences with the intense emotionality of the Yiddish theater and its emphasis on naturalism and realism, their veneration of opera as a comparably emotionally gripping experience, and their characteristically Jewish embrace of the view of European high culture, especially opera and symphonic music, as a tool of assimilation and social advancement. Like many Russian Jews of his generation, Samuel Chotzinoff was transfixed by music, including opera and Yiddish theater, from an early age. Chotzinoff emigrated to New York from Vitebsk, in present-day Belarus, also famously the birthplace of Marc Chagall, around 1895 at age 7, and grew up in a typical poor Lower East Side Jewish environment. His father was a rabbi and a Yiddish teacher. He attended a Jewish school, a cheder. He sang in synagogue choirs. He frequented the library of the Educational Alliance, and even though money was very tight, he took piano lessons and attended the Yiddish theater and the opera, sometimes with questionable means of attaining tickets. Also typical was the fact that he did not remain religiously observant beyond his childhood. And yet, his childhood experiences evidently remained vivid, including his memories of the Yiddish theater and opera that he chronicles extensively in his autobiography, one of his two autobiographies, A Lost Paradise. The initial publication of this book in 1953, during what were arguably the peak years of the NBC Opera, suggests that the ideas and especially the feelings he recounts in minute detail were at the forefront of his mind while he was involved in the TV opera enterprise. In A Lost Paradise, Chotzinoff exudes breathless excitement over the Yiddish theater, whose emotional intensity and emphasis on realism and naturalism, I suggest, informed his approach to the NBC Opera. Even as he writes with detached humor over his own naivete and enthusiasm for the Yiddish theater, he portrays his youthful fervor sympathetically. He attended the Yiddish theater extremely frequently, beginning in 1903 when he was about 14 years old. The all-encompassing, enthralling experience he found in the Yiddish theater is a sentiment expressed in countless other testimonials. Yiddish theater's appeal was premised on the emotional intensity generated by plots with immediate relevance to its audiences. Some were new works written specifically for the immigrant public, while others were translations and adaptations of classic European plays and operas. Regardless of the source, audiences voted with their feet at the box office. They insisted that theater productions speak to them in a familiar way, as Jews, and present narratives or allegories relevant to their lives. Playwright Jacob Gordon's popular Yiddish adaptation and Jewish-themed updating of Shakespeare in The Jewish King Lear elicited a powerful reaction from audiences. As Chotzinoff recounts, during an emotional, tear-filled scene on stage, quote, "The audience too abandoned all restraint, and people all over the house cried without shame," end quote. Chotzinoff also attended performances of both the Yiddish translation of Hamlet, as well as the more heavily adapted version known as Yeshiva Bocher. Here's an excerpt of famed Yiddish theater actor and director Boris Tomaszewski performing the Kaddish from Yeshiva Bocher.
ויולמו يبروك يروسي بيام ليخ مالخوسي يخويا يخوي يدخل بيتي ترويل يخوي يدخل بيتي ترويل فاقولو يبين مالخوري ويري
Chotzinoff's comparison of his reactions to both Hamlets and to Gordon's version of King Lear suggests that the question of how an adaptation could affect an audience was very much on his mind while he was developing opera on television. Indeed, just as Yiddish operettas modified their original sources to make them appeal to their audiences, so too did the NBC Opera. Fighting opera's reputation as culturally intimidating, Chotzinoff emphasized the genre's affinity with other kinds of popular entertainment, even its superiority to them. As he asserted, opera has more color than a football game, finer drama than all but the best of motion pictures, and music and song far superior to anything heard on Broadway. That's the audience we're aiming at, the millions who want all of these things but have learned to be afraid of grand opera. The technology of TV broadcasting in the late 1940s and 1950s, small screens, mostly black and white images, low quality sound, short time slots, limited what could be done with opera. But embodying Wordsworth's observation that nuns fret not at their convent's narrow room, Chotzinoff marshaled these constraints to productive ends. Along with the NBC Opera's music director, Peter Herman Adler, Chotzinoff sought to highlight opera's emotional intensity. To do so, they made new, modern-day English adaptations of opera so audiences could understand the words as they were being sung. The abridgments and other adaptations they made to fit operas into a 60-minute time slot, later 90 minutes, also helped hold the television audience's attention. This is not to say that non-Jews didn't espouse similar aesthetic ideals. Translating and adapting opera into the vernacular had, of course, long been done in both Europe and America, including as part of Opera for the People. But given that opera in mid-20th century America was mostly performed in foreign languages, I suggest that the Yiddish theater was a more direct inspiration for Chotzinoff. The new operas in English that NBC commissioned for television too, like Menotti Zamal and The Night Visitors, were also built around spotlighting characters' emotions, capitalizing on the camera's ability to present close-ups of faces, provide reaction shots, and control the energy and pacing of a scene by varying the length of shots. NBC's emphasis on communicating opera's emotional intensity is evident in the 1955 broadcast of Puccini's Tosca, sung by Leontine Price. For more on the significance of her involvement in the program, I refer you to Danielle Ward-Griffin's work, as in her Library of Congress presentation that I'm about to show Tosca clips from. Let's watch the scene where, spoiler alert, Tosca murders Scarpia, paying attention to the way the camera work highlights Tosca's emotions and thought process.
Shortest. You mean by water? Yes.
The intensity of the scene is undeniable. Puccini's music does most of the work, of course, along with the stage action. But the use of English for American audiences and the camera work, foregrounding Tosca in close-up, takes us into her mental process, making the experience gripping and emotionally realistic. The Yiddish theater offered its audiences a similar experience. The sometimes outlandishly melodramatic action of the Yiddish stage notwithstanding, the aesthetic favored by audiences and critics was known as realism, a style pioneered by Jacob Gordon. His exceptionally successful plays of the 1890s, like The Jewish King Lear, deliberately rejected the artificiality of the fantastical, romantic, spectacle-filled Yiddish operettas in favor of plots that dealt with situations resembling audiences' real-life experiences. Other playwrights, too, were praised for their realism and naturalism, terms that were sometimes used interchangeably. Chotzinoff recounts a domestic scene in a play that had, quote, captured a bit of naturalism familiar to everyone. It set the entire house rocking with laughter and people commenting, "How true," or "a real Lebensbild, a slice of life." The legendary Jacob Adler was widely praised for his naturalistic acting. See what you think. Although this hardly seems realistic by modern standards. The 1902 book Spirit of the Ghetto by Hutchins Hapgood, a very interesting character, provides valuable insight. Quote, "To be natural, to be real, to express the actual life of the people with serious intent is what Jacob Adler stands for. The acting on the Yiddish stage is constantly animated by the desire for sincerity and naturalness," end quote. Even less skilled actors in lesser plays, Hapgood notes, quote, "succeed in introducing the note of realism." This is precisely the kind of realism and naturalism that Chotzinoff pioneered in the NBC Opera. TV's use of close-ups required performers who could both sing and act convincingly, bringing opera into line with the realism-dominated visual conventions of popular screen culture. NBC Opera producer Charles Polacek, also Jewish, noted that the program's production style, quote, "was developed for TV, much more natural in style rather than the overblown operatic style," end quote. As Chotzinoff himself put it, quote, "with television pointing the way, live opera will have to become as natural, as convincing as we in the television studio have labored to make it." NBC Opera director Kirk Browning, too, observed that the program was, quote, "rooted in what we now call the off-Broadway theater and in the movies, both of which thrived on realism." Reviewers agreed. The LA Times, for example, described a scene in NBC's production of Cavalleria Rusticana where, quote, "the details the camera picked up were not artificially contrived, but showed the villagers preparing for the Easter celebration with every evidence of naturalness and conviction." Chotzinoff was also inspired by opera at least as much as by Yiddish theater. Love of opera is in fact a leitmotif running through the experiences of many Jews of this period. I choose the word leitmotif deliberately, since Wagner worship seems to have been endless, like his melodies, among Jews. Though Chotzinoff himself was passionately pro-Wagner, the question of the supremacy of the Wagnerian or Italian-French styles was the subject of frequent, heated debate at Katz's music store on the Lower East Side, where Chotzinoff spent a great deal of time. As one of my favorite cartoons illustrates, among cantors too, there was a history of being drawn to opera like moths to a flame. Opera was the dangerous secular flip side of sacred liturgical music. Beyond similarity of singing style, both cantorial and operatic singing are also characterized by the communication of emotional intensity. And as you heard in the Tomaszewski excerpt, the cantorial style often found its way into the Yiddish theater. Chotzinoff's description of being carried away at the Yiddish theater and at the opera are remarkably similar. Describing the famous actress Kenny Liptzin in the tragic Gordon play Die Schite, the slaughter or the butchery, Chotzinoff writes, she, quote, quite overwhelmed me with a display of emotional tension and an outburst of passion such as I had never before witnessed. The play seemed especially designed to exploit her peculiar powers of both understatement and savage fury. Compare his reaction to a performance of Beethoven's Fidelio, as he writes in his second memoir, Days at the Morn, published in 1964. Quote, throughout the opera, I was on the verge of tears, and I often felt helpless under the constant attacks of the music and the story on my emotions. The opera tore at my heart and made me weep for pity and joy. These are merely a handful of examples of Chotzinoff's excitement about and veneration of all things opera. David Sarnoff, the head of NBC, who provided Chotzinoff with a platform for his opera program, was also a Russian Jewish immigrant. Like Chotzinoff, Sarnoff grew up poor on the Lower East Side, having emigrated as a child from a tiny shtetl near Minsk, where Sarnoff received a traditional Jewish education and upbringing. In New York, he attended classes at the Educational Alliance and sang in synagogue choirs, including under one Cantor Kaminsky. According to his biography that is Sarnoff's biography, written by Eugene Lyons, who was Sarnoff's first cousin and whose original name was not Eugene Lyons, it was Cantor, quote, Cantor Kaminsky who awakened the boy's love of good music. The humble Cantor, he said in substance, I'm quoting here directly, had affected American life and taste more than he had ever dreamed. The love of good music he, the Cantor, implanted in a boy's heart had been responsible, decades later, for Dr. Walter Damrosch's Music Appreciation Hour on the radio, for the first live broadcasts of Metropolitan Opera performances, for the Toscanini concerts on the air, and other Sarnoff innovations, end quote. This unambiguously points to the significance of his Jewish musical experiences in shaping Sarnoff's predilection for opera and symphonic music. Sarnoff appears also to have had some experience with the Yiddish stage, selling candy and soda pop in Second Avenue theaters. According to Lyons, too, quote, now and then he managed to take in a show on Broadway, also noting that as often as possible, Sarnoff, quote, splurged the 50 cents for a seat in the uppermost gallery of the Metropolitan to hear an opera, end quote. Chotzinoff was able to convince Sarnoff to not only put the NBC-TV Opera on his network, but also to back the project financially, making it into a sustaining program, that is, one without commercial sponsorship. Sarnoff's history of democratizing culture through radio and television perhaps accounts for his willingness to support Chotzinoff's project, despite the fact that, as Time magazine reported in 1949, the first year of the NBC Opera's existence, sponsors considered opera on television to be, quote, poison to ratings. Sarnoff's and Chotzinoff's motivations for pursuing the NBC Opera, I suggest, thus come in large part from the high valuation that the Jewish immigrant community in the early 20th century placed on various forms of traditional European high culture, viewing them as tools of assimilation and social advancement. Jews could succeed in and be accepted by mainstream society by embracing the philosophy of Bildung, of personal education and refinement that could be accomplished through familiarity with prestigious culture. According to Lyons, opera was, quote, the very symbol of culture for an elite, and Sarnoff ached to bring it to the populace. Chotzinoff similarly portrays Sarnoff as feeling a sense of obligation to bring high-quality music to the mass public. Part of this sense of obligation may have come from their Jewish background in a cultural milieu dominated by socialism. The idealistic political fervor permeating much of Lower East Side Jewish life aimed at uplifting and enlightening the working class. Indeed, Tony Michaels writes that in this socialist environment, Chotzinoff, along with his two sisters, quote, became radicalized in the late 1890s and 1900s. In 1947, Chotzinoff also established the Chatham Square Music School, a nonprofit organization for working-class Lower East Side children, revealing his commitment to musical outreach. For Chotzinoff, highbrow musical culture was thus a stepping stone into the mainstream world. The final page, and the title itself of A Lost Paradise, vividly depicts his bittersweet feelings of literally and metaphorically stepping out of a traditional Jewish environment, characterized by Hasidic dance and song, into a gathering of knowledgeable and worldly musicians in Katz's music store. This anecdote represents Chotzinoff's own assimilation through music, leaving the Jewish sounds of his home behind, even as he was ambivalent about doing so. While it may seem ironic that the most famous aspect of the Jewish-run NBC Opera's legacy was the Christmas opera Amal, it fits perfectly into the venerable line of Jewish-created secular mainstream Christmas hits like White Christmas and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Chotzinoff's and Sarnoff's Jewishness is similarly silent in the sense that there is nothing explicitly Jewish about the NBC Opera. But one can arguably hear or understand Jewishness through the program's embrace of an aesthetic rooted in the early 20th century American social, cultural, and political Jewish immigrant experience. The NBC Opera, I suggest, thus has a silent but significant Jewish underscoring. The Yiddish theater especially offered a model of adapting prestigious culture in ways that did not shy away from making radical modifications to the works to make them maximally appeal to mass audiences, speaking to them on their own terms. In addition, the NBC Opera was premised on the value many Jews of the period placed on democratizing opera, part of a long-standing pattern of Jewish consumption and performance of prestigious culture, especially music, as a pathway to social acceptance and advancement. More generally, I suggest that mid-20th century abridged English language opera on TV can be understood as a sonic representation of Jewish cultural aspirations. Although no one element of NBC's ideology was uniquely Jewish, many were espoused by plenty of non-Jews, its particular combination of aesthetic and social beliefs was widespread among Jews. Chotzinoff's and Sarnoff's familiarity with the operatic sound of cantorial singing that led them to develop a new style of television opera in English can also perhaps be understood as a metaphor for the assimilation of Jewish immigrants in America as they translated old world traditions for a new world context. The fact that the NBC Opera folded right after Chotzinoff's death makes clear his centrality to the enterprise. But the values the program established persisted, making it significant for the future of opera in America. Many of the techniques pioneered by NBC became central to subsequent opera broadcasting on television. From 1969 to 1971, Peter Hermann Adler revived the NBC Opera in the form of a public television program, NET Opera, directed by Kurt Browning. Starting in the 1970s, Browning also directed for many years PBS's programs Live from Lincoln Center and Live from the Met. The ongoing concern for dramatic realism in opera may also be partly a result of NBC's efforts. Why does this relatively obscure case study matter? It matters because it provides an example of minority groups' contributions to mainstream cultural trends. It also points to the value of considering how a similar outcome, in this case popularly oriented opera, can be reached through different paths and motivations. Above all, it matters because it shows the importance of questioning accepted narratives, of reading between the lines, of looking for unspoken influences and motivations, whether deliberately or unintentionally hidden. This in turn can help us better grasp aesthetic developments and patterns of cultural consumption, especially those that we think we already fully understand, including our own. Thank you.
And sorry for kind of stumbling through this question, trying to work it out as I'm asking it, but it was, first of all, amazing presentation. And I just want to think a little bit about this idea of translation and mediating between that sort of high art culture and the American public, and then sort of where the Yiddish public fits in that. And I'm thinking of, when you talked about like King Lear translated into Yiddish. So this was for a Yiddish-speaking milieu that maybe was simultaneously also trying to Americanize. And so then when you get to this NBC, when you get to the NBCs, you have these translated, and you have these translated operas. You mentioned something about assimilation through cultural prestige. I'm wondering what that kind of does to the cultural prestige of the originals. And I'm also thinking in more Yiddishists can help me with this, but like the Farteichen Farbesser from Shakespeare. Was there any sense of that, like by putting it into, for the non like they, that the translation Shakespeare's translated as make and improved mitar? Was there any sense that of any of that dynamic happening with the translations into English, or was it a sense that it was sort of a compromise with the American public to translate these works?
Those are both really good questions. Thank you for thinking through these things so thoughtfully. I think to answer your first question, there's sort of two parts, I guess, to the Jewish consumption of high culture. One is assimilation in the New World context, to be, to fit in and not feel like they were sort of confined to Jewish, Jewish quarters, and the similar feeling applied to Jews in Europe as well. So there's the being part of mainstream culture is one thing, and then there's sort of another part of that, I think, which is to advance and work your way up the socioeconomic ladder, and which often had a geographic implication. I go like this, like from the lower Manhattan, working your way up. So in New York, I had a very particular geography, but more generally, moving into more affluent neighborhoods and more affluent circles. And I think it's that second part that was part of the appeal of programs like this, which sometimes were denigrated by critics at the time as middlebrow culture, as somehow damaging the original, but it was seen as a social tool for people who maybe didn't have a whole lot of education, who could, through exposure to these, serious and thought-provoking works of art, become more sophisticated, and then, that way work your way into a better job, get more money, look a better neighborhood, your children do better, et cetera, et cetera. I think to answer your second question as far as the, improved aspect, I don't think that kind of, to us now, sort of hubristic approach is something that was in their mind, but there was definitely a sense of improving on old translations of operas. So there's the translation that the NBC Opera did of Don Giovanni was commissioned from none other than W.H. Auden and Chester Kallman, who did this fantastic, just witty and playful, I love it, and maybe not to everybody's taste, but I like it very much. Translation of Don Giovanni, which really, as this has come up in some of the discussions we've had about translations, any translator knows, there's always a compromise. So they definitely stray from a literal meaning in places, but they capture the spirit, which arguably is a better way of translating. So in that sense, Chotzinoff and Sarnoff and Adler working together, I think they thought they were improving on old opera translations with the idea of making it more immediate and accessible to American audiences. Thank you.
Danielle, thank you so much for this presentation. This is so much fun. It ends, asking we've been in conversation for years about navigating around working on similar material like Heartstop in 1940. So it's really exciting to see the next phase of this and to see the same characters coming back in terms of Sarnoff and Chotzinoff, but eating in Missouri with the Opera Theatre. So it's just very fun for me. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your thoughts on how, we both looked pretty extensively into the idea of translation of opera into English in the pre-World War II period and how some of those efforts were huge failures in a lot of ways. If they have these short lives, and especially the double upset, the Awards in the Century Theatre, which failed for numerous reasons, both because of the pull of funding and a whole bunch of other things, Hammerstein, et cetera, et cetera. But, ultimately their efforts are deemed a failure in some sense. My question for you is, to what do you credit the later success of this program on NBC? Why does this succeed in a way when the other efforts in earlier periods fail?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I think we also, in considering this whole question of, opera companies and success, I think we also need to think about what we mean by failure. I think, it depends on where you benchmark your expectations. If you plan to have a 10-year-long opera company and you only last 1 year, that's a failure. But if you just want to, see if you can get a season out and you get audiences, then maybe that's a success, right? So I don't know really what, when we say failure, I think that might be sort of a tendency of historians to look back on older enterprises and say, oh, it only lasted 3 years, therefore it was a failure. So, if it appealed to its audiences and people made a little money and, they went on to do something else, maybe that's a success. So, but the second part of your question sort of still stands as you ask it, and why this succeeded. I think, in large part, it really was, at the risk of being one of those essentialist biographical historians, I do think in this case it's warranted in that this really was very much a project driven by two individuals working together. And I checked the dates really closely. I mean, of course, just because he died doesn't mean that that's why the program ended. But, I spent a lot of time looking at the archives at at the Library of Congress of all the NBC papers, all these, typed up, typewriter, internal and external communications and letters and press releases, some of which went out, some which didn't. And you can see all the edits, which are also really interesting, how they're framing it, how they're modifying their framing to appeal, and promote this program. I think really delving into those materials just always highlights the fact that Chotzinoff was really committed to making this happen. And I mean, they went to some extreme lengths. I mean, Sarnoff basically just bankrolled it. He said, okay, I'll do it. And sort of think he's kind of closed his eyes. But he was, he knew they were spending a lot of money. But the logistical challenges when they were, at some point when they were filming, the early broadcasts, by the way, were all live streams. So it was only later that they started introducing recorded in the studio and then broadcast it later. When they were doing some of those live ones, they had the orchestra on one floor of the building and the singers on another floor. And they had these live feed cameras so that the conductor could see the singers and the singers could maybe see the conductor on some other little screen. They would try to coordinate it across floors. And so it was, the point is that they spent a lot of money and went to great lengths to make this happen. And, the last broadcast that they did in 1960, they did the Don Giovanni with Cesare Siepi, who was just a fantastic Don Giovanni. Despite singing with, his Italian accent in the context of the American singers, I mean, his dramatic flair and like sort of the one earring, it was just, it just gives such a wonderful flavor to the whole thing. This is all by way of saying that that was a broadcast that they were able to get commercial sponsorship for, and they were pilloried for this because, like, I think it was the Florist Telegraph Agency, some kind of flower company, and so I think they were experimenting, like, well, can we maybe make this work? This program has been around for since 1940. It's been around for a decade. It's doing well. Maybe we can try commercial sponsor, but they had to put in the spots for the, send flowers to your loved one. Nothing says, happy birthday like a nice bouquet of roses. And the critical response is just scathing, even among people who are generally very supportive. They say, having this, this Mozart's genius interrupted by these, horrific commercial ploys does more damage to the opera. And that's the only case where you see that. And this gets to the other question I'll just briefly, I know we need to get to lunch. That Zeke asked, which is, to what extent are these modifications seen as damaging the original? And that's an argument that a lot of middle brow critics, people like Dwight MacDonald, and of course coming from the Frankfurt School, and Adorno and his friends and frenemies, complained about, modernizing, updating high culture because they really damaged the original. But it really seems that in most contexts, people of the period, the promoters and the audiences, saw these things as just alternatives that were maybe they liked or maybe they didn't, but the original was sort of its own thing, maybe partly because for so many of these operas were already pretty far in the past. I mean, not the new ones, not Menotti, obviously, and the other new ones that they did, but the classic sort of operas, the ones that would be the most likely to come in, to be labeled as highbrow or prestigious, they were so well established that you really can't do too much to them, I think, by that point. So I think in that sense, that's how they were saved from the scourge of the evil middle brow. So that's my perspective on that. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela.